Peace, peace. What does it do? All powers to oppress people, African power to an African people, and black power. It's your brother Yang and Kruma. Getting along with the go along. What we have seen pop up in the movement, which I have always encouraged and promoted, is a cry, a clamor for more political education. So I have noticed that political education groups are popping up, more political educators, more brothers and sisters whom would call this their forte, or maybe this their very strong point in what they do in the movement, have begun to step forward and begin to practice political education and advocate political education. Hate to be an I told you so, but I am definitely going to say I told you so in this instance. I have been a strong proponent and endorser and supporter of political education from the very beginning. I'm gonna drop the link, but I'm gonna do some reading, son. So it'd probably be a little more reading. But yeah, let me drop this link, man, and invite my people on, because I really wanted to do my contributing to political education. And let's get my guy on here. Do my contributing to political education. And like I said, it's much needed, especially in the light of everything that has been happening with the exposés, the so-called leaders being ousted, these people who would take the forefront or take the lead being ousted. And it's, I can't say that I feel bad about it. I think that it's probably time overdue. So yeah, we know the way to ensure that certain type of elements won't exist within the movement is political education. We at the P.E.C, the People's Education Committee, say that informed people make informed decisions. So when right information is presented, then, what's the old adage? When you know better, you do better. That's the adage. With that, what we'll begin, and the last time that I had done a P.E.C series, I was doing the developments of the Black Panther Party, from the first development all the way up into the development we had. I got a very good response from that. That also came from the writings and the teachings of my Jega, which can be translated into mentor, roughly. Brother Dr. Muhammad Ahmad, also formerly known as Maxwell Standford, the founder of Revolutionary Action Movement, very prolific brother. When he was acting as one of my instructors, one of my guides, someone that was very influential in my development as a Black nationalist, as a revolutionary Black nationalist, that is, he was a professor at Cleveland State. He had, since then, I don't know if he's still in Philly at Temple, but from there he had became Temple's head of Black Studies Department, as he was the head of the Black Studies Department in Cleveland State. At Cleveland State, he became Temple's head of Black Studies Department. Genius. That's all I can say about the man. Genius. And that would be an understatement if you ask me. So we'll be coming from his writings. And I wanted to start with Black Intelligentsia. The Black Intelligentsia. Why? Because a lot of our leaders come from this class. They come from the intelligentsia, historically in equity, from the times back when they slapped the shackles on us and we begin to develop tactics and strategies for our liberation and our freedom. A lot of those came from the Black intelligentsia, a lot of those people. But what is the Black intelligentsia? Why are they our leaders? How did all of this develop? And Dr. Muhammad Ahmad gives us, not just from a historical perspective, but like I said, as the founder of Revolutionary Action Movement, gives us a perspective from the revolutionary. So this is what we'll be coming from. The Black intelligentsia of America has been productive in its development over the last 100 years, but has not yet developed a cohesive ideology theory that the African American masses have utilized in the effort to obtain the overthrow of institutional racism. What is the intelligentsia? The intelligentsia are not an order bound together by a historic vow, but the social spectrum which embraces all kinds of brain work. They are the interclass group, being the brain workers, the ideologists for the class they identify with. Because of the spiritual nature of the work that the intelligentsia does, it inevitably forms a spiritual tie between them and the possessing classes. This is a saying of Trotsky, and it can be found in Trotsky's Intelligentsia and Socialism. This, what he says here, what in quoting or paraphrasing Trotsky, what Dr. Muhammad says here, he says, due to the spiritual nature of the work that the intelligentsia does, this lets us know that our struggle for freedom, for liberation, for the humanization of a dehumanized people, for the right to live a decent standard of life for the people who have been suppressed, oppressed, and denied that right, to call to that, to rally that, to incite that is spiritual. It's a very spiritual work. And it says, due to the nature of this spiritual work, it develops a tie between the intelligentsia and the possessing classes. The Black intelligentsia has been alienated from its African roots. Therefore, unlike other potential middle classes, it has not produced an effective leadership that could give a revolutionary ideological direction for the African American nationality. I'm going to read that again. I think I want that to sink in. The Black intelligentsia has been alienated from its African roots. Therefore, unlike other potential middle classes, it has not produced an effective leadership that could give a revolutionary ideological direction for the African American nationality. In various social movements of the 19th and 20th centuries, intelligentsias have emerged from the nationalities, potential middle classes, or intellectual proletariat. So in the 1920s, the 19th and 20th centuries, intelligentsias have emerged from other nationalities, potential middle class, or the intellectual proletarian. And the doctor will go into what an intellectual proletariat is. Giving a mass ideological direction to these nationalities. Though ideologies vary among intelligentsias, most have been motivated by the ethnic group's national and class interests. Let's slow that down. I'll rewind that a little bit. Before that, Dr. Muhammad says that the peace, man, to the chat, peace, straight talk. Before that, Dr. Muhammad says that the Black intelligentsia has been alienated from the African roots, enabling it to provide a sound revolutionary ideology to get us out of this mess, just from the disconnect of our origin. Whereas we find in the study of revolution, the emerging of an intelligentsia from these other ethnicities, the emerging of an intelligentsia from their potential middle class or their intellectual proletarian, their intellectual working class. We find this happening in the 19th and 20th centuries, revolution, these people rising up. And it says, though amongst these other classes, though their ideology may vary amongst their intelligentsia, one thing that they have in common, or one thing that they're striving for and they're seeking a tactic or strategy, is the group's national and class interest. That's the difference between their intelligentsia and our intelligentsia. Though their intelligentsia may disagree on how to arrive there, they may even disagree on the ideology. They say one thing that is driving them, the common denominator, the cohesive factor, is that their intelligentsia rises up and seeks solutions that are inspired and motivated by their natural and class interest. Dr. Muhammad goes on and further says, being brainwashed or whitewashed against having an African consciousness, being brainwashed or whitewashed against having an African consciousness with everything that it represents, the African-American petty bourgeoisie could not develop a program around an African-American national mass motivation. Wow. Being brainwashed and whitewashed from the African consciousness and all that it represents. And we remember those days. African booty scratcher, go back to Africa, anything affiliated, associated with African and bringing an African consciousness was discouraged. And even in the days of prior, even under pain of death. So it was discouraged. So the African-American petty bourgeoisie, when we rose to develop a petty bourgeoisie class, couldn't frame a program around mass African-American motivation. They couldn't get a program for mass African-American motivation. Why? Doctor says psychological alienation. Psychological alienation led them to seek, and we still see this. Listen to this. Listen to what the doctor said. Psychological alienation led them to seek an economic and political solution that was against the nationality's interest. What do they call this? Accommodationism and black capitalism. Psychological alienation, being alienated, being separated, being isolated, being divorced from the origin and who you are, you're mentally. Psychological alienation led them to seek an economic and political solution that was against the nationality's best interests. And we still find people advocating, promoting loudly a economic and political solution that is detrimental to the nationality's best interests. It is upward mobility for individualism. Psychological alienation, man, the doctor really breaks it down. And the doctor says this is called accommodationism and black capitalism. Accommodationist and black capitalist would push the solution in purely, solely, without social cultural interactions, without a proper ideology, just wholeheartedly jumping into the system as it exists now, the accommodationism and black capitalism. The petty bourgeoisie, since they're divorced from the African consciousness, would have you think that this is the solution to our problems. Doctor goes on and said, instead of struggling for the development of a collective power, he says they organize for individual power, material accumulation for members of their class. Let me read that all together so we can get that in context, right? Psychological alienation lead them to seek an economic and political solution that was against the nationality's interest. This is called accommodation and black capitalism. Instead of struggling for the development of collective power, they organized for individual power, material acclamation for members of their class. The major intellectual contribution of the African-American middle class has been of attempting to record African-American history. He says the major contribution of the African-American middle class, the petty bourgeoisie, and this is not to sneeze on his contribution, has to be historians, has been to be our historians. They have recorded the history of African-Americans. That has been their major contribution, which at times falls short of what it should be. The conclusion draws from the principle and tactics of accommodation or achieving integration into a capitalist America, which is both unrealistic and impractical, if not a suicidal goal for the masses of African Americans. Dr. Muhammad Ahmad, formerly known as Max Standford, founded the Revolutionary Action Movement. That was with Malcolm, that with, study your history, go back. This is why I gave the name. All right. My dear brother, my Ndugu, Makasa, Shaka Jijaga, one of the things he advised me to start doing, he said, Ndugu, start giving your references. And I thought that was wonderful. So my reference, look up Max Standford. See if he isn't qualified to give this analysis, to write these papers. Look him up. And what he's telling us here, he says that the majority of the petty bourgeoisie, the majority of the black middle class, their contribution to our liberation struggle has largely been to document history. And he says, and at times that falls short of what it should be. Why? Because their conclusion draws from the principles and tactics. Their conclusion draws from the principles and tactics of accommodation or achieving integration into a capitalist America, which is both unrealistic and impractical, if not suicidal, for the masses of African Americans. I mean, I don't know what I could add to that. Basically, what Dr. Muhammad is telling you is that they're romanticizing it for you. You're fed up, you're frustrated, you're tired. This is why we call it the struggle, and they're romanticizing something for you. And where they're getting their data from, where they're coming up with this ideology from, is a place of accommodation, integration, material accumulation, and black capitalism. Black, and not collective power, not moving as collective. And these are the words of Dr. Muhammad, whom says that coming from these places and trying to get a theory from that, he says, is unrealistic, impractical, if not suicidal for the masses of black Africans in America. The doctor goes on to say the greatest spokesman to emerge from the African-American middle class was W.E.B. Du Bois, who for 50 years tried to work out a theory for achieving integration in monopoly capitalist America. The greatest spokesman to it. Shouts out to W.E.B. Du Bois. Listen, as a black nationalist, I reserve the right to get tickled at some of the folly, but that is from a place of hindsight. So I'm not so arrogant as to think that I'm better. I understand that I have the privilege to have had great teachers, you know, to come like Dr. Ahmad Muhammad, to come and analyze their predecessors or our predecessors, and to give us, to do it objectively, and to give us, you know, a sound understanding, especially those of us that embrace a revolutionary ideology. The greatest spokesman to emerge from the African-American middle class was Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, who for 50 years tried to work out a theory for achieving integration in monopoly capitalist America, only to find himself in exile in Africa. What? Admitting his mistake of opposing Marcus Garvey in the 1920s and advocating socialism as a solution to the plight of 40 million African Americans. Now, this is where it gets tricky, because I consider myself, I embrace aspects of African socialism. Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, to my understanding, was embracing socialism as expounded by Marx and Lenin, you know. But we say that he had vehemently opposed the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey, they say for 20 years, only to find himself at the end of his life recanting that bull stuff, integrationism, upward mobility and advancement for the petty bourgeoisie and black capitalist America, or even creating a black capitalist America like that, that would aid and benefit the masses of black people. He, in the towards the end of his life, like he said, found himself in exile in Africa, admitting he was wrong and apologizing. In all social movements, especially among the intelligentsia, there have been differences. In all social movements, especially among the intelligentsia, there have been differences. These internal differences or contradictions have occurred over tactics of how to achieve liberation, self-determination, and power for the masses. There's always been differences in this. The difference between militancy versus moderation, reform versus revolution, nationalism or separatism versus integration, or some form of cultural and political autonomy, pluralism, that's what that's called, pluralism, have occurred within the ranks of the Black intelligentsia before the destruction of chat-tailed slave system. I'm gonna run that back, because a lot of times we don't feel like, I hear us talk about, oh, we're so diverse, we're too diverse to get along, we can't do anything. Man, stop biting into that. What people do you know are monolithic? What people? You know what they call that, don't you? They call it a cult. It's called a cult. What people do you know are monolithic in everything they do? So I'm going to rerun this, because here Dr. Muhammad says that this is a natural occurrence. Dr. Muhammad says in all social movements, especially among the intelligentsia, those who are informed, those who may have some training or some know, especially among the intelligentsia, there have been differences. There have been differences. And these internal differences or contradictions, he's calling them here, have occurred over tactics on how to achieve liberation and self-determination and power for the masses. It's not a problem these differences are occurring for solutions for these things. He gives us an example. He says, for example, the difference between militancy versus moderation. This is the difference that exists within our struggle. We think because we have these differences, oh, we can't work together. Militancy versus moderation, reform versus revolution, nationalism versus integration, or some form of cultural and political autonomy have occurred within the ranks of Black intelligentsia before the destruction of chattel slavery. We've been having these internal differences and these ways of trying to figure out how we're going to obtain our liberation, our self-determination. We've always had these type of differences. They haven't had to stop us then. What is this thing now? That all of us have to be on the same mindset. We should embrace these differences and begin to put them in a pot, and we find out, begin to find out what's valuable, what's usable, realistic. From the days of the abolitionist movement, there has been differences over the direction of whether African Americans' fate could or should be left in the hands of white Americans. Differences can be traced back to the ideological arguments between Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany and Henry Highland Garnett in the Colored People's Conventions from the 1830s to the late 1850s. That can be found in the book, A Survey of the Negro Convention Movement by Howard Holman Bell. This is where this information came from. Let me read it again. And some of you should remember, I think that Son and I, the Arena Uncensored, shout out to the Arena Uncensored, us Black nationalists. A lot of us introduced you to Martin Delany. Not a lot of us. We introduced, Son and I introduced a lot of you to Martin Delany. And so here we have, you're finding out these differences didn't just pop up overnight. They didn't just pop up with Malik Zulu Shabazz and Tahaga Bay. We've always had differences. And he goes on to say, he says that from the days of the abolitionist movement, there has been differences over the direction of the African Americans' fate, or should our fate be left in the hands of white Americans. Differences can be traced back to the ideological arguments between Frederick Douglass, an integrationist, and Martin Delany, a Black nationalist separatist, and Henry Highland Garnett in the Colored People's Conventions from the 1830s to the 1850s. See, this is what, the integrationists, the assimilatists, the accommodationists, they won't tell you that there has always been a parallel movement. There has always been a parallel or contrary ideology expressing and favoring different tactics and strategies than that of the integration and the assimilatists. But since, what they say, the conqueror writes history. So since the conqueror, the oppressor, writes the history, he's going to write in a more favorable relationship with his oppressed masses. So he's going to write in integration. He's going to write in accommodation, and he's going to exclude from history the Martin Delanys, the Martin Delaney's, the Henry Highland Garnetts, and the thing. And in fact, the Colored People's Conventions from the 1830s and 1850s. A lot of you thought we were freed and we just went off and started doing our own thing. We actually began to organize and figure out what our next move was. You know, but like I said, the accommodationists will write that out of history. The doctor goes on to say, pragmatic problems in ideological directions have arisen because the African American is in a condition of domestic colonialism. Follow me. Follow me here. Problems in ideological direction have arisen because the African American is in a condition of domestic colonialism or possibly neo-colonialism. I say neo-colonialism, but I like that domestic colonialism. In a foreign country, separated from his historic native land, stripped of native culture, heritage, religions, language, physically outnumbered, and trained to hate him or herself for over 400 years. Don't sleep on it. I'm going to read it again. Problems in the ideological direction have arisen because the African American is in a condition of domestic colonialism or neo-colonialism in a foreign country. Yes, in a foreign country, separated from his historic native land, stripped of native culture, heritage, religions, languages, physically outnumbered, and trained to hate him or herself for over 400 years. Do you not think that a problem in ideological direction and motivation would not arise? I don't know too many people who have gone through that. I don't know too many people who have suffered the horrors that the Black African here in America has suffered and the struggle to regain a sense and a semblance of our true self, first just by coming to our right mind. You tell me what people have suffered and struggled through that to that degree. This oppression has made African Americans other than themselves. Even though they have retained some of their African heritage, separation and return would almost be an automatic response among the oppressed people taken from their land if allowed to retain their folkways, culture. But for the African American, return becomes a more complex question, and alternative theories have emerged within the last 368 years. We're going to run that down again. I'm going to slow that down. Because what the doctor is telling us here, he's saying this oppression, that being in a foreign land, being robbed of every sense of being related to a mighty people or any people, they have you thinking you sprung up from the Cabbage Patch, or slavery is the beginning of your existence as a human and a Black African. So the doctor is saying here, due to that, the stripping of our language, our mores, our norways, our religion, our culture, our customs, all of these things, that this oppression has made African Americans other than themselves. It has made us other than ourselves, even though we have retained some African heritage. It has made us other than ourselves, even though we have retained some African heritage. Separation, now he poses this. He says separation and return would almost be an automatic response among an oppressed people taken from their land if they were allowed to retain their culture. If you took a people from their land and didn't, the horrors visited upon us wasn't visited upon them. If you took a people from their land and didn't strip them of their identity, and you freed and you oppressed them, and then amongst their liberation or amongst their emancipation, they're freeing, you said, what do you want to do? Of course they want to go back home. They're retaining their culture, their heritage, their norways. They miss home. They have an attachment still through the homeland, through their very culture, Their culture will bespeak of their homeland and their ways and their customs and their traditions. It's going to create a longing, a desire in them to return home. It says, however, but for the African American, return becomes a more complex question. And alternative theories have emerged within the last 368 years. There are some of us who are staunch nationalists who say we're not going anywhere. We home. My origin is Africa. My origin is, as well as some indigenous, some aborigine here on the shores of what is later to become known as North America. But for the most part, we are here. We're home. So the stripping of our African identity and leaving this void and our filling this void has created what we are. Praise God. This Black African American. Yeah, we're here. We're here. So it makes repatriation for some of us problematic, and that's a discussion. The most popular of the alternative theories amongst the African American middle class in recent years has been integration or assimilation into capitalist America. So the most popular theory for the petty bourgeoisie, for the so-called middle class, for our liberation has been integration and or assimilation. And that still is a very popular theory amongst the so-called petty bourgeoisie or middle class. Now, in this economic climate, it is hard to make a distinction between, hey, free spirit, it is hard to make a distinction between so-called middle class and lower class and all this. So we look at tax brackets. See, we look at tax brackets. So these people that fit in a certain tax bracket, some of these Negroes or these Black people whom will tell you, we're getting tired of supporting you guys on these government programs and stuff. They are, and I don't think any of it's done maliciously. I think that they're, like it said earlier, they're looking out for their class, and we've been forcibly taught to be a divorced people. Disunity has been forced upon us. We are quicker to be disorganized. I mean, we have the slogans to go for, oh, you can't trust Negroes. Negroes can't get together on money, crabs in a barrel, da-da-da-da. I mean, we have the jargon and the slogans to aid our disunity, to motivate chaos. Black nationalism is an ideology of solidarity and collective power. So we have these proponents of anti-Black nationalism, which a lot of times I don't think that they even are aware that they're pro to the degree homogenization, accommodation, assimilation in a failed, corrupt system that Dr. Muhammad said earlier is unrealistic, unattainable, and even in some cases suicidal. But this is the option that they give you. Historic analysis, the doctor goes on to say, historic analysis of the Black intelligentsia is difficult because they often waver between the national class aspects of national liberation and integration, militancy and moderation, reform and revolution, either national or international. So he's saying that to get a proper, the doctor is telling us to get a proper historical analysis of the Black intelligentsia is very difficult because our struggle is so wide, and that we don't set, the Black intelligentsia hasn't set on one ideology, hasn't set on one theory. Even one person from the Black intelligentsia, it says it varies due to the climate. The doctor says that it wavers between the national class aspects of national liberation and integration. It wavers between militancy and moderation. It wavers between reform and revolution, either national or international. And this is what we find ourselves at this time. This is why political education is important. I believe in radical reform, though I'm not a reformist, I'm a revolutionary, but I believe radical reform is the step to revolution. I'm a militant, But I believe in moderation in certain times and instances that lead to the militancy that will call for Black people to understand the importance of embracing militancy. But first, we will know militancy, not this shit that is being masqueraded as militant. Not these people, and this is no knock on, if you're not doing this, you're not doing this, but not these Negroes thinking they're out there Black freedom fighters, but they are only carbon copies of, like Dr. Muhammad said, neocolonialist, they are neocolonialist military copies. And I'm not even talking about the formation. I'm talking about the ideology and the methodology, from the way that they think, even to the way that they implement it. Very neocolonialist. Or we wouldn't be having a lot of the problems that we face. Because one thing Black people, this is why, because when we emulate the white people, assimilation, homogenization, we find these problems jumping in so-called, and especially in our so-called militant divisions or our more military divisions of the formation. We find these problems arising because of the neocolonialism. Why? Because Black people make terrible white folk. It's one thing we can dunk a basketball. There's nothing we can't do as melanated people except emulate white folks. We make terrible white folks. Anytime we try to be like them, we just fumble the ball. We make terrible white folks. So stop it. Be yourself. So we find the Black intelligentsia going between these various motivations. The basic difference between the national class aspect of national liberation often is that one believes a socialist revolution is necessary to achieve parity. They say a lot of times this is the difference. The issue of militancy. So he's going over the issues of the difference. I'll go back over that. The basic difference between the national class aspect of national liberation often is that one believes a socialist revolution is necessary to achieve parity, to equality and things. They believe that it must kick off in a socialist revolution. You will find that thought prevalent amongst a lot of revolutionaries. The issue of militancy versus moderation is a tactical question, while the national class question, self-determination versus integration under capitalism, relates to the means of obtaining African-American goals. That of using reform demands or engaging in mass revolutionary action to achieve the objectives of self-determination and national liberation. So he's breaking down again. I'll slow it down. He says, the issue of militancy versus moderation is a tactical question, while the national class question, self-determination versus integration under capitalism, relates to the means of obtaining African-American goals. That of using reform demands or engaging in mass revolutionary action to achieve the objectives of self-determination and national liberation. He's breaking down the various issues into two. To achieve self-determination involves African Americans laying down the tools, participating in a general strike and aligning themselves with Chicanos, Latinos, Puerto Ricans, Asians, Native Americans, and white workers to bring forth a socialist America. This is the doctor. Some of these things I'm agree with, some I'm not. We see here where the doctor really has the Dr. Muhammad, who is brilliant still, the socialist leanings of a collective, all oppressed peoples shaking off the shackles of oppression. In theory, I love that. I think, though, the first essential step is like what he had in Revolutionary Action Movement, and what our dear brother Malcolm said, that before there can be Black on white unity, there must be Black on Black unity. We must learn to work together, to organize, to do these things together. The very nature, I'm sorry, I didn't turn the page. Waverance and ambivalence. Waverance and ambivalence. Wavering between the national class aspects of national liberation and nationalism and integrating comes from ambivalence. Wavering between the national / class aspects of national liberation, the wavering, the not being solid, comes from ambivalence. Ambivalence is to not really take a stand. Let's look it up. The definition of ambivalence. Let's see what.
Here's the definition of ambivalence: the state of having mixed feelings or contradictory ideas about something or someone.
The state of having mixed feelings or contradictory ideas about something or someone. So the wavering between the national and class aspects of national liberation, nationalism and integration, that going back and forth and not being solid, comes from ambivalence, conflict, mixed feelings, or a contradictory feeling. Where does this come from? Ambivalence comes from historical and present day systemic brainwashing. This mixed feelings, these confused feelings, the contradictory feelings, the doctor says, which is known as ambivalence, the doctor says comes from historical and present day systemic brainwashing. Let me listen. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. This systemic brainwashing, this false class, this national and race consciousness. This is the brainwashing, systemic brainwashing. So ambivalence comes from the historical and present day systemic brainwashing, false class, false national and race consciousness. This brainwashing over a period of years has produced a self-destructive, misogynistic, self-hatred complex within the African-American psyche. Wow, doctor. This brain, and I'm going to read it again. And a lot of times I will reiterate these points so that you can really, so that you can grasp them. This brainwashing over a period of years has produced a self-destructive, misogynistic self-hatred complex within the African-American psyche. So complete has the brainwashing that it has produced a conditional inferiority reflex in the African-American. Man, come on. Doc is laying it down. He says, so thorough is this systemic brainwashing that it has produced a conditional inferiority reflex, not complex, reflex in the African American. What is a reflex? That you react to. We have an inferiority, according to the doctor, an inferiority reflex. How heavy is that? The very nature of the American society causes each African American to have a negative, traumatic experience sometime in their life about being born African or having African features. The very nature of American society causes each African American to have a negative, traumatic experiences sometime in their life about being born African or having African features. Peace. Oh, they're trying to shut us down. They don't want you to get this PE. and what's crazy is I'm at the studio where I work at, up here at People's TV. So, I know it should be good. I'm going to wrap up because I usually only go an hour. I want them to do this last thing, and then maybe we'll do a little run through and see what's cracking in the studio. But like I said, it says the very nature of the American society causes each African American to have a negative traumatic experience sometime in the life about being born African or having an African American or having African features. The African American is constantly bombarded with the anti-African image through radio, television, movies, videos, DVDs, CDs, newspapers, and magazines, because all of the heroes, power symbols, etc. are Caucasian in America. And we have to remember that this was written a little while ago. So now they call themselves having black heroes. But if you ask me, most of the black heroes or just further black exploitation and denigration of the black image, a lot of the so-called heroes are anti-heroes. They're not doing, we more of the same. We went through it with the Superfly, with the pimp being the man, and the cocaine dealers being the man, black exploitation. Now we find it with BMF and Raising Cane and Power. It's still further black exploitation. Just because black people have always contributed or had their hands in the demise of us as a people. And some people may think, oh, it's not that serious. I take it that serious, because it's just further selling the black male image. I know they say it's entertainment, but we have to be very careful on how we portray ourselves or allow ourselves to be portrayed in media, So he's saying that we are constantly bombarded with the anti-African image. And I would say this time also with the anti-progressive or positive or moral black male, black female image. The one good little dad we did have, they say he was putting drugs in white women's drink and groping white women. I mean, damn, we couldn't even have Bill Cosby, right? So we say our images we've been bombarded by anti-African images, and I would say also anti-moral, anti-righteous, anti-uplifting images of black people, men and women. This is backed up with 306, as the doctor further states, this is backed up with 368-year negative complex towards African existence. This has left the African American with a complexing personality. I like that. He says this has left us with a complexing personality. Ambivalence, this mixed or this confused, this contradictory feeling, ambivalence. Ambivalence is the mixed or conflicting feelings about the oppressor and comes from the desire to be like the power or dominant symbols. Ambivalence, this contradictory, this confusing, this mixed or conflicting feelings about the oppressor comes from the desire to be like the power or dominant symbols. The ambivalence occurs between the intra, the in group, emotions directed toward self, or group and extra, the out group emotion directed toward the oppressor. Did you hear that? The ambivalence affects us. Like this, the intra, the ambivalence occurs between the intra, the in group, you, your internal, you, your people, and yourself. This ambivalence, this confused, this contradictory feeling is your intra. It affects the you, you're confused about you, and it affects the extra, the out group, how you feel about your oppressor. Ambivalence affects, you're confused, you have contradictory feelings about your oppressor, you're confused about you, and you're confused about your oppressor. The most common conflict occurs between the intra, the in hatred, and extra outer hatred intra-love, the in-love, the self-love, and the extra-love, the out-love, the love of the oppressor. He says the most conflict feelings happen there, the self-hatred and the outer hatred for the oppressor. This is where the ambivalence comes in, the confusion and contradiction. The self-hatred of your self-hatred and your hatred of your oppressor, and then the love of yourself and the love of your oppressor. Yeah, he didn't beat you crazy like that. From traumatic experiences of racism in America, the African American develops an extra hatred for the oppressor, an outward hatred. He develops a hatred for the oppressor, the Caucasian Anglo-American Saxon or nationality. But the African American, through the conditioned reflexes, also develops a false extra or external love for the oppressor. We have that hatred for the oppressor, but through conditioning and reflexes, we develop a false love for the oppressor, the ambivalence. Which comes from fear and respect for power and success. So this hatred and this love, this ambivalence, this crazy feeling we have for the oppressor comes from fear and respect for power and success. Also from the conditioned reflexes comes an intra-love, intra-hatred, an internal hating, a hating of the self, being that the love and beauty symbols are Caucasian. So from this ambivalence, from this subjective behavior, from our confused and contradictory mind state, we have a self-hatred. Why? It comes from that all the symbols of beauty and love are Caucasian, or the predominant symbols, or what's predominantly projected to you are Caucasian or Caucasian-like. This internal hatred, this intra-hatred feelings constantly conflict with the natural intra-love, with the natural self-love. So this self-hatred that we've been subjected to, that we've been conditioned, that they are trying to make a natural reflex in us, this self-hatred creates ambivalence because it conflicts with the natural intra-love, the natural self-love. The African-American both loves and hates him or herself, and also hates and loves the oppressor. While 400 years of traumatic experiences would seem to be rational proof that the oppressor will not reform, the African-American still wants to believe that they will reform. You know what the doctor said? The doctor said, you would think after 400 years that this would be proof positive. The treatment, the blatant treatment, I mean, even now still being murdered in the streets, still being discriminated against, racism still being very prevalent, very real in your face. You would think that the Black African here knows that this devil, that this oppressor will not reform. You would think that that would be proof enough. The doctor says, while 400 years of traumatic experiences would seem to be rational proof that the oppressor will not reform, the African American still wants to believe that they will reform. Therefore, more intimate the relationships between Caucasians and African Americans, the more African Americans will have a self-hatred and an external love, unless the traumatic experiences have destroyed them. There will be a higher degree of ambivalence, confusion, and contradictory thought. There will be a higher degree of ambivalence among those who have a high respect for Caucasian culture and intellectual capabilities. You will be more confused and contradictory in your thought and mixed up in your feelings the more you hold the Caucasian culture and intellectual capabilities to certain regards and respect and esteem. You're going to be confused because your natural self is going to be like, you do know that's a devil. Historically, they have proven that they're devils. You do know that's a devil. But subjectively, you've been conditioned to have reflexes, and what is appearing to be real is their success and their power, and their way seems to be the way that works, capitalism. So now you're thinking political, economic empowerment without social, cultural interaction and changing these ways. You're thinking that jumping into the system will solve all of the madness, and you're sadly mistaken. It will only increase your confusion, your ambivalence. In concluding, ambivalence has been one of the main problems among the Black intelligentsia in the past years. Not having knowledge of the past or of African American history and being psychologically cut off from the outside world through conditioned reflexes, the African American has been like a piece of driftwood. The Driftwood Theory is this. If the Driftwood Theory is, if the historical continuity of a people, if the historical continuity of a people is destroyed, and if influences from other peoples or cultures are denied them, they become susceptible to suggestions. Let me read that in. The Driftwood Theory is that if the historical continuity of a people is destroyed, and if influences from other peoples or cultures are denied them, then they become susceptible to suggestions. Only the present concerns affect them. Then they become, only denied that a decision. Only the present concerns affect them because they have no conception of the past and have lost the ability to perceive the future to their advantage. I'm going to read it one more time. The Driftwood Theory is that if the historical continuity of a people is destroyed, and if influences from other peoples or cultures are denied them, then they become susceptible to suggestions. Only the present concerns affect them because they have no conception of the past and have lost the ability to perceive the future to their advantage. To destroy ambivalence, to destroy this contradictory, this confusing, this mixed feelings or psychological state amongst a colonized people, a national intelligentsia must constantly present them with the traumatic experiences of the past and present and intensify their group anger until they judge oppressors as the enemy and conclude from group action that oppression must be destroyed. The intelligentsia must show the group its link with the past relationships with the present, and how it applies to the future. This is how ambivalence, conditioned reflexes, and driftwood thinking can be destroyed. To destroy ambivalence among a colonized people, a national intelligentsia must constantly present them with the traumatic experiences of the past and present. We must never let you forget and get caught up like a lot of these petty bourgeoisie accommodationists, assimilationists, integrationists are trying to get you to do. But the intellectual proletarian, the revolutionary will never let you forget. Dr. Muhammad says here, Dr. Muhammad Ahmad rather says here that we must constantly present them with the traumatic experience of the past and present and intensify the group's anger until they judge the oppressor as the enemy, not as your friend, until they judge the oppressor as the enemy, and conclude from group action, not individual action, and conclude from group action that the oppressor must be destroyed. That is the only option. And that the intelligentsia must show the group its link with the past relationships with the present, and how it applies to the future. This is how ambivalence, conditioned reflexes, and driftwood thinking can be destroyed. I appreciate everybody tuning in, sitting with me. Did our thing for political education. There again, when you come in, hit the like, Smash a like, subscribe. Also, check me out with my guys, my fellas, my brothers over there at the Arena Uncensored. Think we're gonna be probably doing something maybe later on. If not, and I'm coming back tonight. You know, shouts out to SVDL, the only league. So yeah, get with us. Stay tuned. Definitely smash. We're gonna put it up. Definitely smash. Like I said, when you go over to the Arena Uncensored, the like, subscribe to the Arena Uncensored. You know, I appreciate everybody for tuning up. Let me see. Support, hit the Cash App, People's TV. Come down for, if you've seen the video live, People's TV, come get you a spot, man. Let's keep our thing on the air. You know, let's always remain the voice of Atlanta, be able to bring the people information and do things, and support the P.E.C, People's Education Committee. Cash App's below. I'll check you next time. I might even see you a little later today. But until then, man, I'm going to leave you like I greet you, and that's all powers to oppressed people, African power to an African people, and Black power.